Om Shanti. Good evening. Welcome to this session of Interview with the Raj Yogi. And our topic today is spiritual pioneer. If that's of interest to you, if you want to be a spiritual pioneer, we can explore that together. But as usual, we'll start with a reflection. With one thought, I move my attention from being outward focused to being focused inwards. The world outside fading into the background, and my inner world becoming very clear and vibrant to my awareness. There are parts of my inner world that have become like uncharted terrain. I have places that I go over and over again, very familiar places, thoughts, feelings, attitudes. They're like ruts inside. And because they motivate my actions, my outer world also becomes very familiar. The same patterns, the same results. And I start to crave newness, looking outside. But in fact, it always starts inside. How to create new pathways inside, new ways of seeing things, thinking about things, until there are new pathways inside, exploring that uncharted terrain inside. There can't be any newness outside. Becoming a pioneer in my own inner world. Om Shanti. Om Shanti. Welcome to Interview with the Raj Yogi. And as Julia's mentioned, the topic this evening is spiritual pioneer. But before we proceed, we want to just check in for those on Instagram. Is the voice better now? We're hoping to get some sort of signal. Perhaps just to let us know if needed. So actually what inspired this topic was that as souls know, or maybe souls don't know, thank you, that this is a study of Raja Yoga. And so it's really the study of me as an eternal being, as a soul. And so this was inspired because a very lovely soul, and we use this phrase, let the body, early this morning. You can say pass away doesn't really seem the same. And this is a soul that I think you knew quite a bit about. She was quite instrumental in terms of the centers being established here in Canada, perhaps in America. Could you share a little bit about Sister Chandru as we talk about what a spiritual pioneer is? Yeah, I actually did not have a lot of interaction. Our paths would cross, but really, even though she's also on the west side of the continent, did not have a lot of interaction. but the few times our paths crossed, I always thoroughly enjoyed. And very, very light soul. And I think what I feel most of all from the stories that have been shared and the times I had with her is this just remarkable, the courage of that soul. Um, there was a period, of course, it's hard for us to imagine maybe if we're connected at all with BK centers or the study, but to imagine there was a time, of course, when there was no BK Brahma Kumari's presence at all in Americas, Canada, in this region whatsoever. And so those who came first, just into a context which may not even have been that open to what they were offering. And really, I don't know how else to say it, crazy things they did. We've got these two sisters driving in the 70s, driving around in a car through the winter in Canada, no real connection with anything, just to establish a presence, to introduce the Brahma Kumaris, and really just completely sort of unwelcoming soil, going in completely cold, if you will. So I think it's the courage of that soul, but with so much lightness. Like now, if we have to do any small little project, we have so many thoughts and get so worried and so heavy and so what if and these souls are taking on really what most of us wouldn't even consider, and incredibly light, so light, like the faith of that soul was remarkable, and really paving pathways in completely uncharted terrain. So I think the courage, the faith, the lightness, and so light that I think some might, I'm so sorry, on Instagram, it's coming and going, but some might almost dismiss the depth or maturity of the soul because they were just so light. But I remember the times that I would hear Chandru Ben share on spirituality. She'd always start very entertaining, very light, but there was always a depth, a zinger at the end of her sharing that would stay with me. So very light, very easy, very humble, very courageous, and the perfect formula to be able to go into situations that I think most of us would be terrified to go into. So that's what you need when you're a pioneer.
So it's interesting during the reflection when you're mentioning about being a pioneer in my inner world. And because it's so easy to go, oh, I want to be a pioneer, and sort of just emulate sort of the choices that they make on a very physical level, and sort of dismiss what's going on underneath for one to be a pioneer. I think that just in general, I do find that many are inspired by those who are pioneers. I don't necessarily in the physical sense, but that step of courage.
Mm-hmm. We have a saying with respect to the first student of the Brahma Kumaris, Brahma Baba, who we think of as the penultimate spiritual pioneer. And the saying is to follow in the footsteps. This is what you do, is that there's the one in front, they pave a path so that the rest of us can walk that path. And I always found that really interesting, that saying to follow in the footsteps, because I think it's so important not just to externally follow what they were doing, but what enabled them to do what they were doing was something that happened inside. And that's the piece that we need to follow first, it feels like, is what happened inside, what realization or insight did that soul have, such that there was that, we say courage, but that faith or that trust or that certainty. What were they experiencing inside? That's kind of what we want to unlock. if we're really going to follow in those paths, especially when we're talking about spiritual, because spirituality is all about the invisible, the incognito, the internal, and the eternal. So we want to understand what was going on at that level.
So about the first student, and he definitely was the spiritual pioneer. In relation to soul consciousness, for those who have taken Raj Yoga, I have observed that soul consciousness can often be put on the wayside. It is the first lesson. It is also the most difficult lesson. And I would say it's also the final lesson too. What do you feel was so profound in terms of soul consciousness for the first student, Brahma Baba, in terms of him being a pioneer?
When we talk about being a pioneer and what seems to impress us so much, we use the word courage, the fearlessness. Even if I think about pioneers of the West going into these completely unfamiliar situations, so the fearlessness and the soul consciousness, we can have nice meditations and conversations about soul consciousness, but then I really want to experience it so I can capture the benefits of soul consciousness, which include that fearlessness. The idea, what would you do if you knew you did not die kind of feeling. So that fearlessness, not just in terms of the body, but actually most of our fear comes in terms of ego, ego death. So soul consciousness liberates us from the fear that ego imposes. I've noticed even, in fitness, something that simple and not really life and death, just very simple, that souls will not even go into a new fitness class or try a new exercise because they're afraid of looking silly. So the ego stops them from newness. So that fear that ego imposes, how can I be liberated from that? What would I do if there was no fear of failing? So the ego death is perhaps more frightening to us than the physical death. So being liberated from both of those, that's really soul consciousness.
What is the relationship between this aspect of ego death, or I was just talking about ego, and value? The reason why I'm asking this question is you're saying ego death, there's such a fear. So not being able to go into, just unfamiliar territory. And sort of on a side note, why that inspired that question was, I was visiting someone in a seniors care home. They have this television on, everyone's just sitting in front there. And they were showing that, there's this documentary going on. There's 3 different separate families in the Americas who are going on this adventure for years, it seems like, looking for this lost treasure. And they would risk their lives. They would go through underground terrain, the things that they would do. And the main thing I was thinking of fascinating was like, they would risk their lives looking for this lost treasure. And so I was thinking about they would do that. Mm-hmm. What is it that's drawing them, and what is it that would be drawing one to be a spiritual pioneer?
I think first off, when we're talking about pioneering, it brings into our mind the destination or objective. What's the promise that the pioneer is pursuing? So if we looked at, say, the West, when they had souls coming, when we were trying to get souls to populate other parts, they're all sort of settled in the East. and how to get them to populate these newer parts of the country in the West. And so they would advertise a promise, the promise of owning your own property, the promise of a new life. So always we're dangling in front that objective, the promise of greater value. Something of value is the promise of the pioneer, or liberation from something degrading. So the migration, the migrants, the transients, the promise of moving somewhere to a better quality of life. So it's always in pursuit of something of greater value. Now, in spirituality, the something of greater value that we're going after is of the self. It's actually housed in the self. So there's a promise of reconnecting with my value as a human soul, which we call self-respect. It's at the other end of the continuum of ego. Ego is a false sense of value. It's really not based on the self. It's always based on external validation. Whereas in spirituality, we're reconnecting with the intrinsic or inherent goodness of the self. So that's the promise that spirituality offers to the pioneer. And I think that value of self, there's nothing more important to us. So yes, we're willing to do some pretty crazy things if in our mind we're convinced this is adding to personal value. And so that's, I think, what's motivating the pioneer. The beauty of self-respect is that it not only is reconnecting with the only true source of value, it's a type of value that enables you to value others, which will only increase your personal value, whereas ego pits your value against someone else. And that actually decreases our value. So that promise of personal worth, I think, is really pulling the spiritual pioneer.
Could you clarify about this? When the value of the self is such that you can value others, that it will increase your value. Can you clarify more about that?
Well, it's kind of we have so many illusions in our head, really bad formulas that are perhaps formulated by ego itself. And one of those is that I get ahead by going in front of others. I mean, even if we look at a race, and I remember in racing, it's a really deep sort of learning, or I want to say de-learning, because I think it was going the wrong way. But I remember the joy of running and enjoying running with others. And then you get into, the older grades, you're getting older, and they now have this idea of race. You're going to race against others. And what they are teaching us in that moment is, if you can go faster than the other people, you will get first place. You'll be of greater value. It's a really deep lesson that we didn't have before. We're quite happy to just run around, and it didn't matter who was in front or behind. We're just running around together and playing. But suddenly we're put in this situation where if you can run faster than the other people, you'll be of greater value. And I can remember distinctly moments in my very short and limited running career, if I wouldn't even call it that, where there were moments when something happened where winning the race, getting ahead was so wrong, that it was just so obvious. The illusion was revealed. In one of them, I remember running a race, and just as I'm getting to the finish line, I can hear the person just behind me in one of the lanes. I don't know how to say this politely, but they were having a physical difficulty, if you will, actually throwing up. So, which can happen, if you don't do things just right with eating and etc. So I remember hearing that, and of course, at that moment, you step into a different awareness. And I'd like to think step into self-respect. You step out of that paradigm of only by getting ahead of others are you more valuable, into the paradigm of really, unless you can support others, you've given away your value. So that's where the getting ahead is actually reducing the value was so obvious, because to actually feel I'm winning while someone else is in distress, the illusion was just revealed. And so the first instinct was it was just as we were crossing the lane, the finish line, was to immediately turn around and make sure they're okay. And all the officials were yelling at me that I have to stay in my lane or I'm disqualified. I thought they were mad. We were just children. They were adults. They should have known better, was all that was going on in my mind. We've got someone in distress here. So that was the only thought. I didn't care about winning. So that's our innate state, is to care about others. And that only honors our intrinsic goodness, our self-respect. The moment we stop caring, start comparing, we're actually reducing. Although we think we're getting ahead, we're actually getting behind. So, and it's something to just experiment with to see how it feels. Ego won't like it. So it might feel like, I'm losing something, but the soul will love it.
Is that where one becomes a pioneer because of this resistance of ego? You can say right now in the state of the world, we have this, when we're not ourselves, we have this common agreement that we should compete with each other. We should, actually award someone if they would put themselves ahead of others. That to be a pioneer first within oneself. I thought it so interesting. You said step into one's self-respect. No one would really think about putting someone else in front is having self-respect.
Self-respect means I am so full, content, and comfortable. I do not need to go outside to experience my own worth. And when I'm that full, content, and comfortable, when I have a complete independent sense of my own worth, I don't know what other word to use, but afford to support others, to put others in front. So it will look like humility, but it's actually based on self-respect. I'm just what I can afford when I'm that wealthy or rich inside, that content. I can afford a lot of activities that I could not afford when I'm empty and seeking inside.
Can you clarify then in terms of this? How about just someone who's just people pleasing? It looks like they're putting people in front, are they not?
And I think that and that's the beauty of developing an inner space, a quiet space inside. I hope those on Instagram are okay. A quiet space inside, because when I'm really quiet, I can feel the difference. I can actually feel the difference when I'm really liberated versus still in bondage. So it externally will look one way, but internally I still can feel I'm in bondage. I'm still very frightened. So the pioneer is, I feel very vulnerable, fragile. It feels like what I'm basing my worth on is still very external. And the reason we know is I'm very sensitive to the response I get from others. So in people pleasing, I am so sensitive that the other person is pleased. So, I want them, I see this so much, souls that are so thoughtful of others and so generous. But if at any time they don't get the response they want, they become what we call very sensitive. So I'm still very affected in people pleasing by what responses come back, or if it's even acknowledged. You let someone merge in front of you in traffic, and you don't get that little wave in the rearview mirror, and you're upset. So whereas with the self-respect, let them, if they don't even acknowledge what's going on, they don't even notice you, it's fine. So you're not so dependent. If there's still that dependence on external validation, then I can probably sense that something's off. So I have to be quiet and watch for those kinds of signs and signals.
So there seems to be this aspect of one's own value, going back to what is spiritual pioneers about one's own value with respect to resistance, but then also the benefiting others that increases one's value. Do you feel there's a different impact than someone who's people pleasing versus one who's in their state of self-respect and just naturally puts others in front?
One thing I think that's a very obvious sign is the incognito nature of when it's coming from that self-respect. The people pleasing is always kind of craving recognition. And so very often those who have that full state of self-respect, we don't really notice what they're doing. I was speaking to someone about this the other day. We have this, and other places might as well, we have this interesting phenomena that happens in Calgary. So we've got this major fitness facility. And when, for the longest time in my childhood, it was called Lindsay Park because that's actually where it's located. So it made it very easy to know what we're talking about and where it is. It's in Lindsay Park, so we call it Lindsay Park. Seems like a pretty good name. And then there came a point when it went through what we call the naming protocol. So whatever big basic, it was usually an oil and gas company, whatever big oil and gas company was providing major financing, the facility would name after it. So for a while it became the Talisman Center, and then it's the Repsol, and now it's being changed again. Yeah, and so it's really hard to keep track of. And in my mind, it's still Lindsay Park. And so you sort of begin, why is it that when they give these donations, they need to have the facility named after it, which is only confusing all of us and really doesn't make it clear where it is. So when I was working with an organization, a big organization that had the facilities named after the communities they are in, which is lovely, because then you know where it is and what you're talking about. But a few years before I left, they started this same phenomena of naming them after a company that supported them. And then it became very odd. So one of them was, one of the facilities was going to be named after a person. And this person's very well known in the community. They've received an Order of Canada. But the funny thing is, they're a very humble soul. So they approached the soul and said, we'd like to name the facility after you. And they said, no way. No way.
That is.
I do not want, that's
very rare.
Horrible. That goes against every ounce of my being. No way. And so they tried different things, and they had a reason why they wanted to name the facility after this person. So they knew this person. One of the projects that this organization did was support programs for children in need in the community. So they went to this person and said, if we're able to use your name, then all of these networks and connections, people who know you, major donors who know you and respect you, might be more likely to provide finances for these programs for kids. That's the only way they could convince him. And at the end of the day, he said, fine, you can use my name, but not my name. You can use my family name. So it has to be named after my family, not specifically identifying me. It's quite a fascinating story. And again, it was for a specific person. He's trying to remain incognito in order to support others. I found a really interesting story. So not needing that recognition, but really so full, so content, just not needing. And I think we all know there's a lot of neediness behind people pleasing.
It feels like one needs so much courage to be that pioneer inside, because everyone is craving for value.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, why the pioneering has to start inside, and to really begin to, we say we're going to new terrain, but what we're really suggesting is we're returning to old terrain or original terrain, that perhaps we all started very connected to our intrinsic goodness. We all started with that self-respect, and we somehow traveled away from it, and we're actually just returning to those roots. So it may not be that familiar. It feels like we're pioneering because perhaps we've been away from it for so long, but luckily it's something that we've known. So we're returning to that terrain. And that's why, considering ourselves to be a soul is so powerful. It's not that I suddenly become a soul because I'm thinking about it. I've always been one, but I am returning to that experience. I'm bringing it back to life.
That really, I don't know, rings true about what pioneer is. It's back to the original, maybe not our derivative ideas of what that means. Well, thank you. Very, very, I don't know, I could go on with this whole spiritual pioneer topic. It's beautiful. Thank you for those who joined. If you have questions, you're welcome to type in the chat box, but otherwise we'll have a little reflection.
When we look at pioneers, we always think about what equipment they had as they moved into those new frontiers. Not quite sure what they would meet, but needing basic resources, food, supplies, protection, transport. And what equipment will I need to pioneer the terrain inside? What qualities will I need to be equipped with? Definitely honesty and perhaps silence. We live in a world that's filled with so much noise on every level, especially in our own heads. My journey might begin with just creating a vehicle of silence within a little space inside that's quiet, that feels somewhat separated from worldly thoughts, a space that's dedicated just to solitude, to reflection, to inquiry, to honesty. Creating that space might be my first step in becoming that pioneer within. Om Shanti.
Om Shanti. Thank you for those who have joined. Just an update. I know we're flying into June right now, so we do have the Raj Yoga Foundations course in Hindi starting tomorrow, 4 Wednesdays in June. And if you wish to register for that, it is available online as well as on site. And you're welcome to visit the center's website for that. You'll also notice on there other Raja Yoga courses, which we highly recommend for the remainder of the summer, but also really encourage the drop-in meditation sessions that are in Hindi and in English. That's at the Northeast Center, but also online too, to be able to actually have that experience, not just a conversation about soul consciousness. So thank you again for joining.